Hello YouTube friends, welcome to The Last Homely House and welcome to this room, which sometimes I call the shipping room, but it's most often now the storeroom, where I store a lot of my fabrics and a lot of my ongoing projects, and also in this corner my quilts. So in this corner of the room I have a lot of the quilts that I've made or I've acquired. They're not all made by me at all, but I thought it might be fun today if I pull a few of them out and talk to you about how I either came to make them or how I acquired them. There's a whole mixture of quilts here and far too many to talk about today, but I'll talk about some of my favourite ones. Shall we do that? I think that sounds like a good idea. So I think then maybe I'll go back in time and start with why all this quilting started with me in the first place. And it was definitely my mum who got me into quilting. She was an absolutely prolific quilter, and she made hundreds of quilts in her lifetime, and that's no exaggeration. She was always in her sewing room stitching quilts. She would just have to hear that someone was having a baby or someone was getting married and she would make them a quilt. And she was an absolute inspiration to me. And one year I challenged her to make me a quilt while I made her a quilt. Now, I made a video about this, and all throughout this video I think we're going to be linking Anna's my daughter-in-law, and she helps me with the editing here, and she's going to be finding clips from these videos that explain to you about what it is I'm talking about. So the first two quilts that I want to talk about are these two. Let's get these two out. Now, I'll briefly explain, but if you wanted to watch the video about this, it was quite interesting what we did here. So I brought some fat quarter bundles in colours that I love and colours that my mum loves, and then I gave her my favourite colours and I took her favourite colours, and we made a quilt for each other and then swapped them. And after she died and I was clearing out her sewing room, I thought I would keep the quilt that I had made for her and put the two of them together. So that's what these two are, and her colours are all these amazing lilacs and purples and things, and with her one I made a trip around the world quilt, and she made me this one here, which is, we'll give you a closer look at all of these, but this was my colours, all the greens and these beautiful pinks. So I really enjoyed that project, and I think it's an idea that if you have a quilting friend or if a relative quilts, that you could challenge each other to make a quilt for each other. So that all the time I was making my mum's quilt and quilting it and thinking about it, I was thinking about her and how she might enjoy this quilt once I'd finished it. And she did. She had it over the back of a sofa for a long time. All of the rest of her life she used this quilt. So she was a big influence on me, and when I was clearing out her sewing room I found a suitcase full of unfinished quilt tops. I think we've all got a few quilt tops. If you were properly enjoy quilting, there's probably a few quilt tops knocking around. And I know why my mum had these quilt tops. It's because she would have the fun of designing and cutting and sewing, and then she got to the bit where it needed quilting and she moved on to the next one. I am guilty of this also. I mean, how many of us actually finish what we start? But my mum didn't, and she had all of these finished quilt tops that I found after she died. And I brought them home here and I finished them. What a task that was. I paired them up with backings, I fixed any bits that needed fixing, and I sent them to my friend Kath, who's a long arm quilter who lives in the borders between Scotland and England, and she quilted all of these for me. And then when they were all finished I bound them all and I gave them all to members of my extended family, and they all have them now, but I kept one for me. And let's see if I can find it. I kept this one for me. And this is a scrappy string quilt that she made. and Kath quilted it in this loopy way, which I like very much indeed, and I kept this one for me because I really liked it. It was quite a thing doing that. Again, it made me very thoughtful about my mum and thinking about why she'd made these quilts and how she made them. And what's interesting about this one is that some of the fabrics from the quilt that she made for me are in here. So I know that this was a quilt that she made much later in her life. I like it very much. And yeah, I really enjoyed that whole series. We made a playlist about it, Anna and I, all about finishing my mum's quilts, which is a number of videos about each of the quilts and me going up to visit Kath in Cumbria to take these quilts to be finished. So I love this quilt, I really do. Before I go any further though, isn't it a shame that we've just got them all piled up here? I think maybe rotating them round so that this one goes on the bed for a little while, and then this one, and then this one, because I tend to just have them here folded up in the room here. What do you do with yours? Do you rotate them round, the ones that you decide to keep? Because it's very nice to give quilts away, isn't it? And so that's another great thing that my mum taught me. And there's a lot of Project Linus quilts going on at the moment downstairs, one of which is a string piece quilt in the same style as this. So yeah, I have a lot to thank my mum for in terms of inspiration and determination, drive. I mean, she was 93 and she was still making quilt tops. Anyway, that's a quilt top that I really like, and I'm glad I kept that one. Yeah, it makes me really thoughtful. Colourful too. Okay, so well, let's have a look. Well, I've just pulled some out here, haven't I? Let me tell you about this one next, because I made this one before I had a YouTube channel. Most of these actually I made before I had a channel. Quite a lot of them that I'm going to talk about I've just made because I liked making them. And this has got a particular story, a bit resonance behind it, because this is all fabrics that I brought back from India when I went to visit Rajasthan with my daughter Martha many years ago now. And we went to the places that make this fabric. They do this amazing silk screen printing and block printing. These are silk screened, these particular fabrics. And we went to the factories where they do that. And we watched them making these fabrics, and then I got to go to the big, huge warehouses where they have all this fabric stored, ready for sale. And I bought 10 meters of many different fabrics and had them shipped home to me. And these are some of them. Now, with this quilt, this is a very simple squares, because sometimes I think that if the fabric's really beautiful, you don't need to over-design the quilt block. I think a simple square will show off the fabric to its best, its absolute best. And this has been years, this is years old, and has faded absolutely beautifully. And so on the back of this one, I just did huge squares. I like the back of it as well. And on the front there are these, I think they're 5-inch, 6-inch squares maybe? 6 finishing at 5.5, something like that. And what I like about this is that the wadding that I chose for this one is really thin. So the thing's got a fabulous drape to it. And I stitched it in big stitches like I like to do, running stitches in all sorts of different colours. And so this one, so that's the other thing quilts do, isn't it? They kind of make you nostalgic for the pattern or the time or the fabrics, where the fabrics came from, and they can make you very kind of... I'm right back in Rajasthan when I look at this. And this is a quilt that I absolutely need to keep out and rotate round and have on the back of a sofa or use it as a lap quilt in the cabin or something. But I like this quilt very much. Of that fabric, I made a few quilts. They're out in the world there somewhere. This was the only one I kept for me, and there isn't any of that fabric left now. I used it for all sorts of projects. I made some cushions, I made all sorts with it. And this is, so this is the last of it. It's very, very beautiful indeed. The fabric, beautiful. And going to that place, India was quite an interesting experience, really. People say, oh, I'm going on holiday to India. It's not really a holiday so much. It's quite an experience, and it's a bit challenging sometimes. You know, the absolutely, completely different kind of culture that you're in, and the different food, and the different pace of life, and it was quite a culture shock for both of us, I think, going to visit there, but one that I'll never forget. And yeah, it was brilliant. But wandering around this factory and pulling out these bolts of cloth and choosing 10 metres of that and 10 metres of that, it was an absolute joy. I wish I'd got more though. I really do. It was beautiful. So yeah, it's good to look at your quilts years later with fresh eyes, isn't it? And have a think about why you made them. You know, whether the fabrics were special or you just made it because you were really driven to make a particular pattern. Which I think one of these is, this next one that I'm going to show you is that. So this one, again, I made this years ago before I had a YouTube channel. And this is half square triangles. And there was one reason why I made this quilt. And that was because I wanted to challenge myself to get really good at sharp corners and accuracy. Because sometimes I'm not terribly accurate. Some of these quilts don't bear close examination because my points are all cut off, or, you know. Sometimes I don't mind that. Sometimes I think it's important to know when accuracy is really, really needed, or whether the joy of making the thing is enough and the finish doesn't actually matter so much. But with this one, I remember trimming these blocks for, it felt like hours. I trimmed all these blocks down, and there's a couple of places where I missed my mark there, but they all got their points, which was the point of this one. The point. So this one is a single bed sized quilt. It's pink colour washed thing. It starts very pale pink and ends up darker reds and pinks, with a neutral, a tone on tone white on the other side of it. And again, this one's hand stitched. Sometimes with hand stitching, when I do, because I hand quilt almost all of my quilts, I sent these off to Kath because there were loads of them. I couldn't think about hand quilting so many quilts. But with these ones, it was more about the technique. So you can't even see the quilting on this one. Sometimes I do quilting because I want you to be able to see the quilting, and that's the point of it. But with this one, the point of it was the points. And I like it very much. It doesn't get used at all, which is another shame, isn't it? What's on the back of this one? So on the back of this one, you can see I only quilted it in one direction. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I thought I'd gone the other... Oh, no. If I'd gone the other way, I would have had to bisect the white triangle, which I didn't want to do. I didn't want to see the stitches on this one. So that one was a really interesting exercise in accuracy. And maybe the next ones we're going to look at aren't quite so accurate. But I loved making that one. I really did love making that one. Okay. So what should we look at next? Oh, this one. Here we are. This is another quilt that I made before I was making videos for YouTube. And this is a quilt. It's a really weird size. That's how wide it is. It's really quite narrow, but it's quite long. So this one would go over the back of the lime green sofa quite nicely and have a few of you leaning on the back of it. I saw a picture in a book by Kay Fawcett about this shirts quilt, and that's all they are, is shirts that I got from the charity shop, men's shirts. And I went and bought loads of these men's shirts, and I very quickly realised that not all shirts are created equal, and some shirts are mixed, not 100% cotton. And so I had a bit of an idea that I wanted to use just cotton on these. One or two of them aren't. That'll have a polyester in it, I think. Yeah. So this shirts quilt then, he put these little flashes of colour on the corners, and so instead of it just being squares of blue and white, we've got this little tiny bit of bonkers colour coming in, which I liked very much indeed. And again, this one was just quilted in the ditch, which then gives you on the back this lovely grid pattern. So actually the back of this one looks really rather lovely. At this time when I was quilting, I'm now remembering, I was using 3 strands of embroidery floss to do all my quilting, which is lovely, it works fine, and there's a big range of colours. I now use Aurifil thread, which you can get as stranded. I have stranded, and I have 12 weight, and both of those work really well. And I think the colours are just zingy and bright and absolutely gorgeous for what I like doing. So my shirts quilt then, I'm thinking I need to get all of these quilts out and use them a bit more. I like that one very much. I think I'd quite like to make that one again, but make it a more useful size. So revisit this one. I don't have any of these these shirt scraps anymore, and as this is the year of use what you have, I can't get any more shirt stuff. You could probably buy bundles of shirting, can't you? I bet that's a thing. That might be something I'll have to look into. You can get a bundle of shirting fabric. Yeah, I bet people even do fat quarters of shirts now. Probably do. Anyway, that's not a quilt that I'm going to make anytime soon, but it is something that I might think about revisiting. So that one's great. So there isn't a video about making this one or this one. Let's see if we can find one that there is a video about. Let's see. This one. Now when I finished a quilt, and especially if it's going to be going to a new home, I like to do this. I like to make a tie for it and roll it up so that it looks like this when the person gets it. So then you end up with a tie out of the same sort of fabric. Okay then. And then what do you do with that? I don't know. Unless you're going to roll it and put it away again. But I think we should have all our quilts out, don't you? And use them all the time. This quilt's got quite a story to it. Again, it's another single bed size quilt. And this is another trip around the world quilt. It's a block I love to make. It looks like it should be complicated, but it really isn't. Once you get the idea of what it is you're doing, you know, making this tube of fabric and then cutting them up, and there's definitely videos about this one, because I'm now remembering this quilt and why I made this quilt. I did a whole series, you know, I have a Patreon channel where I make all sorts of extra content, and a number of years ago, I can't remember how many now, I did a whole series throughout that year which I called the alongs, which were my quilt alongs, with a different quilt block over a number of weeks. And this was when I was talking about the trip around the world quilt and how you would make that, and also the variations of making it. With this one, I laid it out. We'll show you this opened out. I laid it out in a chevron kind of way, and I think the fabric's really funky. I love what I chose for the back. And with this quilt, let me see how I quilted this one. This one's quilted in the diagonal, and this one's got, look, this one's got that rare thing, a quilt label. Now, I wish I was better at embroidery, because I would embroider a quilt label for the back of all my quilts. But this was when I was obviously thought I should have a go at doing that. And this is the Last Homely House quilt 2020. So this quilt's 5 years ago that I made this. So that's when those series of alongs will be. And I did all sorts of different quilt styles during the whole of that year. So with this one then, my intention was always to give this one away to some sort of charity, and it never happened. I think maybe 2020 followed on the heels of the pandemic, so this got put away and was never looked at again. But I definitely think I'd like to donate this to a charity now, where it will go to someone who'd really enjoy it. So maybe I'm making some quilts for Project Linus, so this wouldn't be a Project Linus quilt, or would it? Maybe you can think of some worthy cause that this could go to, and I can donate this one. Yes, that would be nice if you put something in the comments about who might receive this quilt. So that was a really interesting range of fabrics that I bought there. Not my usual style at all, but I mean, yes, it's pink and green, but, you know, why do I say it's not my usual style? I love the back. It's cool, isn't it? Really cool. So this quilt then needs a home. It's never had one. I'll roll it back up again and put its tie around it, and that quilt needs its own home. Again, in the notes below, we'll link to the where you can find these on Patreon, and maybe 5 or 6 videos about each one of these quilt blocks that I made with my patrons. That's a quilt block I'd like to revisit, actually. I really enjoy making a trip around the world. I remember making one once out of Liberty fabric, blue Liberty fabric, all of it. I don't have that quilt any longer. And I made all my little tubes. And then at the time I was going on a long train trip somewhere, and I took them all with me. Because you do need to do a little bit of unpicking of the tubes in a particular way. If you've seen a trip around the world, you'll know what I'm talking about. I've almost certainly made them for the channel as well, these quilts. I remember I have a memory of making a yellow one, which was the most sunshiny quilt I've ever made, and that was another trip around the world, and that one's yeah. So I was on this train unpicking all these rounds and then pinning them back together in their pairs, and it was quite nice because some of my fellow passengers were, "Oh, what are you doing there then?" And I got into lovely conversations with people about what I was doing. I love that about craft. Do you not find that if you're ever knitting anywhere, someone will always stop and find out what it is you're making? It's great. It's very inspiring, I think. Okay, so let's see. What else have we got to talk about? A couple more that I made. And this one is the very, very first quilt I ever made. Now, this one, let's get it the right way up. There, that'll do, I think. Is that the right way up? That'll probably do. This is a tiny, tiny quilt. It's a baby quilt. And it's tumbling blocks. And I made this when I was in my 20s. And baby's blocks or tumbling blocks. And I can't remember why I started making this. But it's all Laura Ashley fabric. And it's all paper pieced, English paper pieced. With these diamond shapes here. And I'm recreating this quilt now for my newest grandchild, a little girl, and I'm making it out of Liberty, the same kind of style here in these tumbling blocks. So it's really nice to have come full circle with this one. This is a quilt I wrote about in a book that I've written. It's in the shop called Kate's Book of Things, and I talk about this quilt and how I started quilting in my 20s. Which is nice to think of. Every single bit of this is hand-stitched, because I'm not sure I even had a sewing machine at the time. And this again has faded quite a bit as well. So this one, yeah, I like this one. Tumbling blocks. So I tell you what though, this is going to be an incredibly long video, isn't it? And we've still got a lot more quilts. So how about I do a part 2 and show you some of the rest of these some other time. But there is one more quilt I want to show you before I sign off, and I'm sitting on it. I'm going to have to move all of these quilts to one side so that I can show you this quilt. I'll tie that one back up in its bundle in a minute. This one here, maybe I should take that downstairs and put it over the back of the sofa. Yeah. This one, not sure, because I've got a lovely quilt on Agnes's bed. I haven't got another single bed. This one though, maybe I'll take that one downstairs and put that over the back of the chair I sit on where the cat sleeps. We'll use that one a bit more. And this is my mum's. And this makes a good blanket for outside if we're having a picnic, because it's quite a robust blanket, this one. But the one I want to show you, I mean, I talked about the little one being the first quilt I made, and that was when I was in my 20s. But then when I got back into thinking about quilting, this was the first quilt I made, the one I'm sitting on. And this one is a huge riot of mad colour. This has faded a lot since I made it. And I remember making this one. I was working at the time in town 35 miles away, and I would work all day. I was a midwife and I worked in a huge maternity unit, and I would come home all tired and sort of midwifed out, if that's a thing. And I would sew on this for half an hour, or I'd get up in the morning before going to work, and I'd sew on this for half an hour, and it was obsessive. It was like a proper antidote to everything else that was going on in my life at the time, and I would just stitch and cut and sew, and I had no idea what I was doing, not at all. And I was very influenced by the quilts of the women of Gee's Bend, and that's what this was kind of based on. And so this was a quilt that I'm proud of. I mean, it definitely doesn't bear close examination, but I'm pleased with how it turned out. And it's the scrappiest, messiest thing ever. But to get me started into quilting, exactly the right thing to do. And so I'm surrounded by quilts now, which has got to be a good thing, hasn't it? And I think next time, if we get back and... Oh, actually, I'm just looking at these as well. While I'm talking about going to India... This was some of that fabric I brought back from India, and I made into these single layer curtains, which I have up here. I'd forgotten about these as well. And they're not great at excluding light or keeping the room warm, not at all, but they're very, very pretty. And that's the important thing for me, is how beautiful things are. So I think if you've enjoyed this video, I'll do another one and talk to you about some of the other quilts that I've got on the shelves behind me, and show you some of the quilts that I've acquired from other places and some more of the quilts that I've made. So yeah, you go and have a look at the ones that you've got stacked up somewhere and think about when was the last time you got them out and had a look at them, because we love making them and we love thinking about making them and piecing them and putting them together and all of that. But then is that it? Is that all they're for? They're not, are they? They're for giving to friends, or using yourself, or switching around on different beds and sofas in the house. So that's what I'm going to do today. But I will show you some more of these quilts next time. And thank you very, very much indeed for watching. In the notes below, there will be links to the playlist about my mum's quilts. I think it's just called Mum's Quilts, or Finishing Mum's Quilts, something like that. There will be a link to Patreon, where I tell you all about this quilt and how I made this and why I made this quilt. There'll be some other links too. I'll leave a link to Kath, the long arm quilter, because she's got an amazing setup there where she'll quilt for people. I'll leave a link to her, and maybe I'll leave a link to the shop where you can buy this book, which tells you all about why I made this quilt. Oh, and then there's another video here, which is the shared quilt here. So there's plenty more for you to look at after this quilt here. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. And I'll see you next time with some other adventure into sewing. And give us a thumbs up, a comment, plenty of things to comment about there. I'd love to hear from you about your quilts and what you do with them, and how you, whether or not you've gone and got yours out and had a look at them and shaken them out and started reusing them again. Remember why you made them. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.